10,870,000. The population of the city of Paris. That is the number of babies that the National Bureau of Economic Research estimates have died as a direct result of the introduction of Nestle's baby formula in lower and middle-income countries with limited access to clean drinking water. That equates to roughly 212,000 deaths per year from the mid-1960s until the present day, and the numbers are not improving. But how could a giant, well-known corporation with ties to nearly every portion of the food industry get away with such a heinous crime? To understand how we got here, we must first examine the company's history. Nestle baby formula was first created in Vevey, Switzerland by Henry Nestle in 1867. Malnutrition was rampant amongst infants who were unable to breastfeed at the time, leading to the deaths of untold children worldwide. Additionally, breastfeeding itself had begun to lose popularity amongst the upper class, as it was seen by many wealthy women as paltry manual labor fit for servants. Henry Nestle aimed to solve these problems with his infant formula, a unique blend of dehydrated cow's milk, sugar, and grain, purged of acid and starch. Nestle's formula quickly caught on and became extremely popular with those who could not feed their infants through traditional means. It also allowed chocolatier Daniel Peter to perfect his recipe for milk chocolate, and the two men formed a partnership in 1879. In 1905, Nestle merged with its competitor, Anglo-Swiss, to create the Nestle and Anglo-Swiss Condensed Milk Company. From here, the companies continued to acquire additional brands and products while experiencing large upticks in sales during both world wars. And now that we have finally gotten all that boring corporate history out of the way, you probably find yourself wondering, alright, but that sounds like any generic company history. Where does all the death come in? Well, let me show you. In the years after World War II, Nestle went on an acquisition spree, acquiring brands like Libby, Magi, Cross and Blackwell, and L'Oreal. Each new acquisition brought in new lines of products and, as a result, new lines of revenue. However, while Nestle's brand was continually growing, sales of its flagship product, infant formula, had nearly stagnated. You see, it is estimated that only about 1.5% of young mothers are incapable of breastfeeding. This posed a huge problem for Nestle as it made 98.5% of its potential customers essentially unreachable. In the mid-1970s, Nestle changed its marketing. Instead of marketing its products only to mothers who were incapable of feeding their infants, Nestle decided to open up its customer base by billing its baby formula as a healthy option for all babies. They did this with a particular focus on third world countries, where knowledge was limited and mothers could easily be misled. Nestle began marketing its product to low-income countries in Africa, Southeast Asia, and South America during the 1960s and 1970s. It was sold as a nutritionally beneficial alternative to breast milk. The catch? While the formula does contain protein and calories in much the same way as breast milk, it lacks in many other areas provided for by its natural counterpart. Breast milk contains components foundational to preventing afflictions such as malaria, pneumonia, and malnutrition, all commonly contracted in low-income countries. Additionally, real breast milk contains components that help develop the frontal cortex and nerve centers. Any deformity in these systems caused by malnutrition could be catastrophic. Because low-income countries are generally not particularly cognizant of health and safety regulations, Nestle was able to engage in a myriad of unethical sales practices aimed at hooking new customers through any means necessary. One of Nestle's most common tactics was to dress Nestle sales representatives up as nurses and send them into hospital maternity wards. Once in the ward, these frauds would act as real nurses, advising new mothers and peddling their products wherever possible. A particularly effective method practiced by these nurses involved giving free samples to new mothers. These samples would contain just enough product to last the baby long enough for the mother to stop producing breast milk. Then, with no other option available to them, the often impoverished mother would be forced to continue to purchase formula for the duration of the baby's infancy, as she would no longer be able to provide for it naturally. In places where they were banned from entering maternity wards, Nestle sent representatives to wait outside hospitals or to gather information from notaries so that new mothers could be called or visited in person later. Nestle had roughly 5,000 of these nurses and other sales representatives on its payroll at any given time. This practice is particularly heinous when you consider that in some countries with particularly low wages, formula could cost as much as 40 to 150% of an individual household's gross income, making it impossible for mothers to afford to feed their babies after their own milk supplies ran dry. Additionally, Nestle sent gifts to doctors and paid them to promote their products. These gifts may be as simple as pens, pictures, or note cards, anything that the doctor might use and that might be seen by prospective patients. Nestle used their influence to plaster posters depicting healthy white babies around hospitals to promote their product as fashionable to the masses. They even provided architectural plans for hospitals in which mothers were kept far from their babies' nurseries in an effort to make breastfeeding as inconvenient as possible so that new, exhausted mothers might be more likely to have their babies fed formula rather than making the journey to feed them themselves. Nestle knew that stress could stop lactation. They used this knowledge to fund advertisements in which breastfeeding was described as less healthy than formula, and in which it would cause sagging and other physical abnormalities that could lead one to look poor and uncivilized. Product stretching. Formula, in and of itself, is less effective as a food source than breast milk. However, if consumed in proper proportions, it can still develop a healthy, happy baby. However, as I stated earlier, much of Nestle's advertising focus was on poor and impoverished countries. This meant that once a baby became hooked on formula or a mother was unable to produce milk as a result of their free samples, they were often unable to afford proper amounts of formula to feed their baby. As a result, many mothers were forced to stretch their supply of formula, often making it last 2 to 3 times as long as intended. This, in turn, led to malnutrition and eventually marasmus, a protein energy deficiency caused by a lack of calories consumed. It results in extremely low energy and body weight. Malnutrition is particularly dangerous in infants. This is because the infantile body is developing at the fastest rate it will at any point in its life. Damage caused by malnutrition while in infancy is often irreversible, leading to decreased mental cognition, physical abnormalities, and impairment. Many mothers also tried to stretch their supply of formula by adding cornstarch or cane water. This led to a protein deficiency as infants consumed excess carbohydrates with little to no protein to help them grow. The resulting disease is called kwashiorkor. It leads to a distended abdomen, which you may recognize from documentaries or donation-based infomercials. Sterilization. Perhaps the largest problem, and the one responsible for the most formula-related infant deaths worldwide, is a lack of proper sterilization. 2 billion people worldwide, or approximately 25% of the world's population, lack access to clean water. This problem has led to outbreaks of disease like malaria, cholera, dysentery, and many other terrible afflictions. These diseases are particularly dangerous to young infants as they often lack the immune strength required to fight off such ravenous maladies. Formula is intended to be reconstituted using clean water and does nothing to negate against any disease found in dirty water. Water can easily be sterilized for use in formula by boiling it to kill any harmful objects within. However, as we mentioned earlier, many people in poor countries where clean water is scarce are illiterate, and formula containers weren't always labeled in the correct language. Nestle knew about these problems, but they simply didn't care as they continued to make more profit year after year. Unsafe sanitation, formula stretching, and generally poor practices meant that infants that were bottle-fed in impoverished nations were 6 to 25 times more likely to die of diarrhea and up to 4 times more likely to die of pneumonia than normal breastfed babies. The publication The New Internationalist first brought attention to Nestle's heinous actions in a report titled The Baby Food Tragedy. Shortly thereafter, the War on Want sensationalized Nestle's actions when they wrote their bombshell article, Nestle Kills Babies, which went on to break down the exact same issues that we have discussed in the video today. Frustrated by Nestle's murderous greed and unwilling to stand idly by, Senator Edward Kennedy took Nestle's marketing practices before the Senate and pled for justice. However, while embargoes were voted down in the United States, the United Nations and the World Health Organization finally stepped up to create a set of guidelines. This code prevented Nestle and its representatives from giving away samples at hospitals, giving free samples to doctors, using misleading information, and giving gifts to babies under 6 months of age. Each Nestle container must include a health warning and portray honest, accurate information that is dissectable to even those with limited literary knowledge. In countries where the code was enforced, Nestle changed their practices to mirror this set of guidelines. However, many of their most profitable countries were third world nations that lacked the knowledge and desire to enforce the code. As a result, Nestle is still able to use their dishonest sales tactics to hawk copious amounts of milk substitutes while suffering no negative ramifications. In countries with a more educated customer base, Nestle changed their marketing scheme altogether from advertisements playing on women's fear and children's starvation to pro-breast milk campaigns in an effort to save face. Even today, Nestle has been caught using predatory methods to generate sales in Southeast Asia, the company's fastest growing and likely least regulated market.
Also Wasser ist natürlich das wichtigste Rohmaterial, das wir heute noch auf der Welt haben. Es geht darum, ob wir das normale Wasserversorgung der Bevölkerung privatisieren oder nicht. Und da gibt es zwei verschiedene Anschauungen. Die eine Anschauung, extrem würde ich sagen, wird von einigen von den NGOs vertreten, die darauf pochen, dass Wasser zu einem öffentlichen Recht erklärt wird. Das heißt, als Mensch sollten Sie einfach Recht haben, um Wasser zu haben. Das ist die eine Extremlösung. Ja?
Nestle buys up local water sources at rock-bottom prices, often depriving people in poor countries of clean water. They then package the water and resell it at exorbitant rates, often to the same people that they deprived of clean drinking water in the first place. Nestle's plant in Lahore, Pakistan, where less than half of the population has access to clean drinking water, was cited in 2015 for not leaving any clean water for its local community. Similarly, 2013 reports indicated that thousands of residents of the Pakistani village of Bati Diwan had become sick after being forced to drink fetid water. This was a result of Nestle draining the town's water supply for use at a nearby plant, where it was bottled for sale at a price that none of the locals could afford. Plants like the one in Lahore have operated for decades, casting doubts amongst locals as to the quality of their water supply. Nestle's presence in the region has also caused the government to neglect to make changes that would make local water drinkable. Nestle has bought out water sources across Nigeria over the course of the last 50 or so years, leaving thousands to die amidst worsening water shortages. Their aquatic greed isn't only limited to third world countries either. In the United States, Nestle targets states with absolute capture laws, which essentially guarantee that a party can capture and utilize any water on land that it owns. This is seen on this map of their bottling plant locations, many of which are centered in absolute capture states like Texas and Maine. This legally allows Nestle to pump rivers, streams, and aquifers dry, destroying local ecosystems in the process. Nestle owns a bottling plant in Everett, Michigan, less than a 2-hour drive from Flint. From 2014 to 2020, hundreds of thousands of Flint's residents were forced to drink bottled water provided mainly by Nestle's subsidiary Arrowhead. Flint's water quality decreased due to a transformation from historic water source, Lake Huron, to the Flint River. This change was supposed to have been made to save the town of Flint money by decreasing the distance that they would have to pump their water. Dennis Muchmore, the chief of staff to Rick Snyder, the governor of Michigan at the time, was responsible for this catastrophic change. And who might Dennis Muchmore's wife be? Deborah Muchmore, Nestle executive and head spokesperson for Nestle in the state of Michigan. Over the decades since this change was implemented, Flint citizens have paid millions of dollars for water that many don't feel comfortable using to water their yards. Over that same decade, Nestle has paid exactly $2,000 at a flat rate of $200 a year to pump roughly 2,024 million gallons of water from clean springs nearby. Now let's consider that 1 gallon of Arrowhead water costs roughly $1.74. This means that Nestle has made roughly $3,168 million in revenue from Michigan's water while paying the taxpayer back just that measly $2,000 to decimate public natural resources. I don't know about you, but something about this situation smells a little bit fishy to me, and it isn't just Flint's water supply. Allegedly. Even California, the wealthiest state in America, is not immune to Nestle's corporate greed. Nestle utilized a bottling plant located near the San Bernardino Mountains to draw water from sources in the local national forest. As many of you will know, this part of California is particularly arid, with San Bernardino experiencing an annual rainfall of less than 17 inches. Despite a 20-year drought in the area, Nestle pumped from bodies of water in the local region, including Strawberry Creek, drastically altering the local ecosystem. Now, this in and of itself is fairly bad, but what makes it much worse is when you consider the fact that Nestle has not had a permit to pump water in this area since 1988, meaning that they have illegally been stealing billions of gallons of water from the water-starved Los Angeles area for nearly 40 years. What if I told you that the last chocolate bar that you consume was almost certainly a product of child labor? This was a harsh realization for many, as Nestle and other major chocolate producers were embroiled in controversy. Kit Kat and Nestle's vast array of other chocolate brands purchased their raw materials from third world farms that employ children and, in some cases, even slave labor. Nestle promised to come clean, pledging to eliminate child labor within their supply chain by 2005. However, even now, in 2024, little has changed. The largest group of child victims by far stems from the small, impoverished West African nations of Burkina Faso and Mali. The Ivory Coast, located on the western coast of Africa, is responsible for about 45% of global cocoa bean production. Farmers lure in young boys from Mali and Burkina Faso to keep prices low by promising school, food, and high pay. The boys, some as young as 10, are then stripped away from their families before being taken by bus across the open border into Ivory Coast. Instead of getting an education, they're worked. Instead of full bellies, they subside off scraps. Instead of reasonable accommodation, they are offered dirty, decrepit huts buried deep in pest-infested forests. Those who are paid are given very little, often less than $1 a week. A hard pill to swallow when one child can pick as many as 650 cocoa pods in a single day, or process up to 1,000. In other cases, children have reported going unpaid for long periods, some even going years without any form of financial compensation. This essentially makes them child slaves, as they are often not allowed to leave the farms upon which they have been imprisoned. At least 16,000 child laborers are estimated to work on cocoa farms in the Ivory Coast alone, with Nestle's South American operations likely accounting for some as well. Nestle, for their part, claims that it is impossible to regulate child labor in their supply chains because their farmers essentially work as contractors and not directly as Nestle employees. However, while they may claim to be incapable of regulating child labor on their farms, they are more than happy to audit farms that did not use child or slave labor. They then chose to exclusively use cocoa from these farms to make their flagship Kit Kat bar, which was marketed to their consumers utilizing an independently verified free trade sticker to improve public perception of their most popular treat. Meanwhile, children still pick the cocoa for most of their lesser-known brands. In 2020, Nestle ceased its partnership with the Fair Trade Alliance, eventually teaming up with the Rainforest Alliance to work on a far more modest public outreach campaign. After all, it's much cheaper to feign environmental stewardship than it is the humanitarian kind. At any rate, at least the trees won't talk to reporters about the injustices done to them.
The work, of course, is far more varied than one would expect to find in a European country. In addition to the clinical conditions common to all countries, the range of tropical diseases is very extensive. One of the great advantages that the Colonial Medical Service has over the system at home is that a medical officer can follow his patients right through. He acts as physician,
Nestle's chairmanship, was called to look into the marketing practices.
Would you agree with me that your product should not be used where there is impure water? Yes or no?
We give all the instructions.
Just answer. What is your position?
Of course not, but we cannot cope with that.
Well, as I understand what you say is where there's impure water, it should not be used.
Yes.
Where the people are so poor that they're not going to realistically be able to continue to purchase that, and which is going to mean that they're going to dilute it to a point, which is going to endanger the health, that it should not be used.
Yes.
Now, then my final question is what do you do, or what do you feel is your corporate responsibility to find out the extent of the use of your product in those circumstances in the developing part of the world? Do you feel that you have any responsibility?
We can't have that responsibility, sir. May I make a reference to...
You can't have that responsibility?
No.